My name is Chris Tompkins, and I am your something this evening to join Pete up here, which is a real honor for me. We're going to talk about silence, which in this day and age is kind of an unusual topic, but by the end of it, you'll see where we come from and why we learn to speak the language of silence and look for it every place we can. Pete McBride, I don't think he needs much of an introduction, but I can tell you that my husband, Douglas, who died 5 years ago in a kayaking accident, met the McBride family years ago. And with the McBrides, you get all their fabulous kids, but you get bush plane pilots, which is our family. You get unbelievable ranchers and beautiful people and conservationists. And that family story has woven us together for a very long time. So it's a real privilege to be up here with Pete. And I'm going to turn it over to him in silence.
Thank you, Chris. What we're going to do today is, first, it's a great honor to be up here with Chris, who has, if you don't know Chris Tompkins, she has saved more land than anyone in history. And we're going to get into that. So I think she knows a little bit about silence, having saved so much land. What we're going to do is I'm going to show some of my work from a recent project I did around silence. If we can get the slides up going. Or you have them going? Hopefully you guys can see these slides. I've lost this monitor down here. What we're going to do is we're going to talk, and then Chris and I will have a conversation, then we'll open up for Q&A after that. My journey to actually thinking about silence started years ago. I've worked as a photographer for National Geographic and others for about 2 decades. And when I came home from assignments, I've been very privileged to work on all 7 continents. I would come back and I would look at thousands, hundreds, thousands of images, and I would often think about the images, but often what would stick with me was not these images. This is in the Peruvian Amazon. It was often not the landscape, but the soundscape that would accompany them. This is the sound of me crawling into my hammock with a little, rain tarp over it, over the flooded forest in the northern Amazon on a trip I spent 2 weeks hiking through a section that kind of stuck in my head and still does to this day. You guys have audio? Now, that is, of course, a lovely sound, and we're lucky to have some of it here in the Rocky Mountains. But we really, in today's world, we've become totally conditioned to the urban soundscape. Whether you're in New York City or even if you're trying to get into Aspen in the morning, this is the sounds we're so accustomed to. Now, one of my first experiences with sound working in the visual media as a photographer is working in Antarctica. And first and foremost, I was amazed by the visual around me, the rich colors and the hues in a place they say that you see every color in the rainbow except white, which is often unique. But we took an assignment for National Geographic. We took kayaks down the coast of Graham Land to do a story on climate change. And what I quickly learned was that sound was as important, if not more important, to my work as a photographer, but also kind of staying safe and surviving in this hostile landscape. And we'd hear the sound of things happening long before we'd see them. So this was a 120-foot natural arch collapsing right in front of our eyes, but we heard the creaks and moans long before we realized we should go up to this place and watch it just shatter in front of us in this colossal kind of changing landscape. This part of Antarctica is changing faster than any part on the planet with climate change. And when we were paddling underneath these icebergs, I would often hear wildlife before I would see them, like this Adelie penguin I heard calling. And then finally I came around the corner and I saw this lone little penguin. And then as I was paddling, penguins would often follow our bubbles. And so these, I learned, if I paid attention and I listened closely, I could hear the kind of quick maneuvering of the water next to me, and then they would leap out of the water trying to evade predators like leopard seals. Now, penguins are interesting this project that I'm talking about is about silence, but it's not about void of sound. It's about the sounds of nature, which is really, to redefine it as being void of mechanical sound. Now, penguins, king penguins, these are on South George Island, are interesting because they identify their young and their parents through sound, not sight. And you can be in the natural soundscape of a penguin colony, 200,000 thick, and realize it is far from anything quiet.
I love this.
Now, I was here last March, and I figured that we were in the perfect spot. Excuse me, 2 Marches ago. Time has slipped from my memory capacity. And we figured this was the beginning of COVID and lockdown, and we figured we were in the right spot on a little island off the coast of Antarctica, South Georgia. But then the phone call came that we had to hurry back because all ports were closing. So we, after sailing for 4 days straight through the Drake Passage, the Mount Everest of ocean crossings, we turned around and went right back through those giant waves, something Chris knows about. And I came back to a different world. I went planes, trains, automobiles, and kind of raced home back into this new lockdown of COVID that none of us really knew what was happening. And as I came through Chicago, I remember them saying over the loudspeaker, "Pastor McBride, please come to the gate 27. Nobody's in the airport, and so I wandered to gate 27. I'm like, what is going on? This is like, our flight's going? I show up to the gate, and Mr. McBride, you will be the only passenger on this flight today. So I got to fly home, a little bit freaked out, like maybe I shouldn't be traveling, but I raced home, and then the world locked down, and then everyone actually started talking about, this crazy pandemic, but people started talking about that silver lining of silence and the sounds we were hearing. And so I locked away in my home, in my office, and I started thinking about some of the projects I've done. And years ago, I'd done a project where I followed the water from this valley all the way down the Colorado River watershed, which, if you haven't been hearing about it, we're now in the greatest drought we've had in 1,200 years. And I looked at the Colorado, which is an interesting lifeline for the American Southwest. It goes 1,450 miles, 7 states, 2 countries, supplies drinking water for 40 million Americans, and I wanted to show the beauty and the silence of places up here. If you haven't been to the Maroon Bells, these mountains are sitting right behind you. The amazing oxbow curvature in the deserts as it flows down through Utah, but I was really interested in the water we used to have. This drought, this mega drought, which I would say we're well past the use of drought. We should be using climate change at this point. We're in our 2nd decade. This reservoir, Mead, the reservoir above it, Lake Powell, are at 24% full. So I was documenting all these things, changing world of water. These are the straws pulling it from it. This takes water to Phoenix and Tucson, 336 miles uphill. And then you see what we've done with our amazing engineering. You take rivers like the Gila. That was taken in 1936, and you see today there is no Gila River at the end. And then when you come to the end of the Colorado River, which used to be the largest desert estuary in North America, this is what I found. And what amazed me, on one hand, is that we had changed the world so significantly with our water consumption, and we'd dried up this lifeline. But what also amazed me, I packed up our boats, I was with a buddy, and we hiked across this 90 miles, is that the soundscape was completely dead. There was no sound. This was the silence void of sound. There was maybe an occasional distant car up in one of the Mexican towns. And then thanks to a group of conservationists, much like Chris here, that devote their life to restoring places, this delta down here over the border went from that to this in 2014. Over an 8-week period, because people really stepped up and found the political will to let out 1% of the river down into the delta. And what amazed me here is that the soundscape that was so void of sound, so naked and dead, bounced back to life like that. The ecological memory just roared back to life, and this is a quick snippet of just some of the sounds. The birds, the coyotes, the fish were even returning. And there was another sound too, and that was the people that live down there. Of course, we often forget there is a huge population of Mexican citizens that call this their backyard river as well. And they were celebrating and singing and rejoicing and dancing their horses. And for just 3 days in 2014, the Colorado River kissed the sea, the Gulf of California. It hasn't reached the ocean since the 90s, and now most likely we won't see it happen again. We were the last people to paddle it to the sea. And after this project, I figured I was done with the river, but apparently the river wasn't totally done with me. I was invited back up here to the Grand Canyon to give a talk about that architect, the state of the water down in the canyon, what was happening. And when I was there, I started hearing about all these challenges our public lands are having, our national parks. And so I decided to take quite literally a little walk in the park. From east to west, the entire length of the Grand Canyon with a friend, Kevin Fedarko, which I thought would be a relatively short hike, turned out to be a little longer, more like 750 miles, 800 miles. The river's about 277 miles. You ask, why is it so much longer to hike? The reason is, I thought it would be like this, a nice stroll down the beaches of the Colorado River. This 50-mile stretch was the only stretch of beach we ever set foot on, because in order to move laterally through the Grand Canyon, you have to move vertically. And when you move vertically, of course, you climb up into the next rocks of layer in order to get water or your food cache, which we'd stored strategically throughout the places. You have to descend back down. So you're constantly going up and around all these different tributaries. And quickly into this project, I was on assignment for National Geographic. I quickly realized I'd maybe chewed off more than I could handle. And this is what you look like about 10 minutes after coffee at 9 in the morning on day 3 and every day. But the concept was to use the hike as the backbone to talk about this place, public lands, what's happening. This is a place that's considered sacred in Grand Canyon. It's called the confluence. The Little Colorado meets the main stem of the Colorado. Many of the native tribes believe this to be sacred. And when we were doing this, there was a $1 billion development project, a very noisy project proposed to go on the rim on Navajo land right down to the border of our national park, our most iconic park, to bring 10,000 people a day. That was in the east. In central Grand Canyon, there is extractive resources. This is uranium mining. This is a quarter mile from Grand Canyon National Park. This is Canyon Mine. It's active. It goes 3,000 feet into the ground. It actually hit groundwater and flooded. So frequently, one of the 11 Native American tribes that live around Grand Canyon, the Havasupai, they come and protest because they're very worried about drinking water contamination because they live on Havasu Creek, which pours right out of the cliffs. Of course, this is also drinking water for 40 million Americans. The water we're drinking here, that water, it's all connected. And then in the very far western side of Grand Canyon, a phenomenon has emerged in my lifetime, in literally the last decade, and that is air tourism. They let helicopters fly into the western side of Grand Canyon and land on the river. This is on another native landscape right on the border of the park. And this is a photographic merge I did to show what 1 day of traffic looks like. This is 363 helicopter flights in 12 hours. I love flying, I love helicopters. It's a great way to see a place, but it's challenging if you're coming to see and experience wilderness and the landscape. Kevin and I made it all 750 miles. We went through 8 pairs of shoes collectively, 4 sprained ankles, 2 broken fingers, 2 girlfriends. And we learned a few things as we moved through here when we look back on this project. It took a year, and when I look back on it, I realized that this place can teach us a lot about our relationship with nature, our public lands, our parks as a whole. And one of them is that this is really a living landscape. Our national parks are living landscapes, and they are critical for biodiversity and habitat. Grand Canyon actually has the widest range of biodiversity of any of our national parks, with over 1,700 species of vascular plants and 750 mammals. It's remarkable. It has a rich ability to see the night sky, something we've lost connection with. So many of us live in the urban world where we can't see the night sky. But the lesson that I walked away with that was most profound to me is I went in as a visual storyteller, and I thought everything for me was going to be defined by texture and scale and color and hue. But the thing that sits with me every day since I finished this project was not visual, it was the auditory. It was the deep blanket of stillness, the godscape, as they call it, that hangs over this landscape that is so rich and profound. And I'll give you one example of a sound I'd never heard and will never forget, is that there are no electronics, your phone doesn't work down there. I was down there a long time. My alarm clock, over a period of time, became the sustenance sound of bat wings, which would show up every morning before the sun even cracked the surface. And I would hear this little whispering over my head and open my eyes and realize that the bats were eating the mosquitoes that had started to sense the temperature change and were flying over my head. And so it truly is remarkable, and it is remarkably fragile. And so it makes me wonder how we think of these places. Every religion on the planet reveres silence. And yet, also many of the native tribal communities revere these places and they call them sacred. But we often go into our wilderness areas and we don't give them the reverence that we do, say, the Sistine Chapel or some place that we would call sacred. So there's a disconnect, and it's something, do we think of this place as entertainment or these parks as entertainment, or do we think of them as something more? Now, silence, that blanket of silence, the void of mechanical sound, is not just important to us, it's critical for wildlife. Elephants, for example, they communicate 8 miles away with each other through a sound we cannot hear. It's a low rumble that they pick up through the soles of their feet and their trunks. And not only is poaching, but the lack of habitat and wildlife corridors and noise is literally turning their worlds upside down. So this was part of a project where they relocated 500 elephants in Malawi from one park to another because the wildlife corridors have been basically broken and shattered, not just from development, but sound as well. And amazingly, all of them survived. They did a remarkable job, but this is what we need in today's world of conservation to adapt. And then I'm going to remind us that there's another sound that we often forget. We've become so enamored with our digital human sounds, our screens, but there is that old ancient sound we've known for thousands and thousands of years, and that's that oral storytelling, which you often hear in Africa. And here's a small example of the women of northern Kenya, the Samburu. And then I'll wrap this up with take you all the way to the northern Arctic, where I went during lockdown of COVID to go do a story for Smithsonian about recent activity they've been hearing about in the Arctic seas around marine life. I went to see a specific species, and right out of the gates, I had this remarkable encounter where I saw a herd of 600 reindeer getting herded south for the winter. And what was fascinating about this is as they swam across this 1.5 mile fjord, freezing cold temperatures, they all swam together in unison, and then they all put their breathing together in unison. So they could hear each other and work together, and kind of resonated with me. Now, I was freezing. I was like a popsicle stick shivering, trying to photograph them, because I'd actually been out trying to hang out and photograph these guys, the orca, often called killer whales. They're not whales. They're the largest dolphin in the world. But I went to go see them, but also hear them, because scientists had been saying that the chattering going on underneath the water and the soundscape had totally changed during lockdown. Lockdown was the greatest period of quietude in recorded history. So suddenly the world and the wildlife was having a moment to breathe and listen and talk to each other again. And so I nervously got in the water. It's 38 degrees temperature. It's polar night. The sun doesn't come above the horizon. We're trying to make cameras work in the dark, and I'm trying to get sound out of it too. And I remember swimming towards this pod that's relaxed. We're not interfering with them, and they're herding herring. And I see this giant dorsal fin appear, and I was like, oh boy. And I dive down, and sure enough, here comes this male 25-foot-long orca. His name is Melvin. They've caught him, fishermen have caught him and released him. They can identify him by the patch behind his dorsal fin. And as I swam down and looked at him, very slightly nervous, there's never been a recorded history of violence with orca in the wild, only in captivity. But I remember he kind of saw his eyeball, and then I felt the sonar pop. He gave me the orca high five. And basically like, who the hell are you in my fishing waters? And it like leapt my heart out of my chest, and I realized there is this whole other language going on in our marine life that we have totally drowned. And it is totally remarkable. And this is a little sample, a little video I pieced together, and you'll hear the orca chattering. They see through sound, and you'll also hear some of the humpback sounds that the humpback come in later.
Well, it's a good day for a swim in the Arctic.
It's early morning, and we're following a fairly big pod, and it was very relaxed, and yeah, try and jump in if it allows.
Apologize, the screens are a little hard to see. Now, wilderness was once tried to be defined by a soundscape as well as a landscape. There's a guy named Gordon Hempton who measured soundscapes within some of our wild places in our national parks. And he calculated that 15 minutes was a nice kind of gauge. 15 minutes of uninterrupted natural sound measured a place of wilderness. And he did 24 places across the northwest of the United States in the 80s. He came back in 2000, not a single spot that he recorded had a time frame without mechanical sound for longer than 5 minutes. So they say our natural world, no matter where you are, we're now kind of drowning it with our, not just our digital sound, but all our transportation devices. So as I bring us back here to the Maroon Bells, we think, well, this place must be quiet. I was curious. I went up there and I sat out all night, and I did another photographic merge to try to understand what is it like at the base of the Maroon Bells, sitting quietly. Can you have 15 minutes? I didn't have one period longer than 7 minutes, because during the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., it's nothing but jet traffic, which is happening, crisscrossing all over the planet. And of course, we love travel. Travel's important, but it's having an effect on all of us. And what's interesting about sound is it's also proven to be very beneficial for our health. It lowers stress, heart disease, insomnia. It's proven to be beneficial for dementia, even Alzheimer's. It helps focus, creativity. The list is long for silence. And of course, we're all part of the noise. This is one day in Aspen. This is 8 hours 2 years ago at this time of year. So we're all part of this game, and I think some way, hopefully this, what I call the think tank of the soul, silence, can be a way to connect us back to these places and remind us that nature actually has a lot to say if we listen. Now I'm going to hand over to Chris, because this is her world, and she's known the sound of a condor wing flying past her, and what she has done for conservation and really rewilding for other species and ourselves and silence is remarkable. So,
well, first of all, thank you, Pete. Bravo! And I failed to say right at the get-go that we are at the Aspen Ideas gathering. For those of you tuning in live on YouTube, Pete McBride and I'm Tompkins, and so late but never. Well, I don't know how many people know about Tompkins Conservation and our background. I'll just be very, very brief. My husband, Doug Tompkins, who really was the mastermind of anything we've done since 1992. He's gone for the last 5 years after a kayaking incident, but there's nothing that's really changed in what we've been doing since we started the first project in Pumalin, Douglas Tompkins National Park. We have some team members here whom I'm also happy about, and old friends who are neighbors down in Chile. But the nut of it is this. He was the founder of the North Face and then sold that, then Esprit. And then when Yvon Chouinard, my boss, and we were making technical rock and ice climbing equipment when I was in my teens and I got out of college, he wondered what I was going to do. I had no idea what I was going to do. Come work for me. And the next year he said, how about making clothes for ourselves? Now I'm 22 years old. I said, sure, why not? And then I ran Patagonia Company for 24 years and ran it for about 20 years. At the early 90s, we both felt like, as Yvon and Doug always said, and they were very much best friends, they wanted to pay their rent for living on the planet. And Doug's adage was, I was making stuff that nobody really needed and wanted to get out and really start. We'd spend the last third of our life going after wild places that needed to be protected and taken away from the possibility of the development of production, and beautiful, important areas biologically that could be restored. And we were very interested in large landscapes. And this was all done in southern Chile and Argentina, though we began to expand a little bit out of that. We were fortunate. We have put 15 million acres of land into national parks, 13 national parks, and about 50, And about 15 years ago, we got, in the late 90s, we started working up in this weird, what I thought was a pretty drizzly, dismal place to work called Iberá. It's a subtropical wetlands, and for somebody that's flat, hot, buggy, yuck. But Doug saw something in that, and we ended up with the province and everybody creating what is just shy of 2 million acre Iberá Park, but a lot of species were missing. And it was really not the first time, but it was the hallmark for us that we weren't in the national park business. We're in the business of leaving behind fully functioning ecosystems, and you can't do that if a lot of species are missing, and especially, of course, if they're at the top of the food chain. So we began and said, okay, wherever we work, we have to ask the question, who's missing? And if they're missing, by God, we're going to go back in and we'll bring it all back. Now, that was easy to say and really tough to do. But for the last 15 years, we work with 22 species, from jaguars who have been gone since the 1930s, and we have 12 jaguars living in free now, reproducing in the wild, from giant macaw, red and green macaws missing for 130 years. They're back and flying and trying to figure out, they can lay eggs, but they're not so sure about how to treat a chick. And every species is different. So,
how's the soundscape changed?
So, yeah, thank you. When I retired from Patagonia, 2 days later, I moved to a roadless area, one of two between Fairbanks, Alaska, and the Cape Horn. And it's a stretch of the southern Chilean coastline, and my husband was a bush pilot, so we could live there. And silence, in the sense that it was truly so isolated. But secondly, the people who I was around spoke Spanish, which I wasn't so bad at it, but jumping from one culture into another and then being in these unbelievably wild and aggressive territories. I mean, these guys really know it. They were the first suckers who came to see us in the early 90s, never came back. No, I'm kidding. Silence to me became another language, and I became to depend on it. And I began to understand that if you get down in the dirt and you stick your ear onto the soil and you listen, it is the beating heart of this planet. It is a foreign language that, as we moderns have adapted so well and absenced ourselves from nature, which Pete knows so well, you have forgotten how to speak, forgotten how to recognize, and I include all of us in this as well, that silence is a cacophony of sound. And it is a thing that will take you back toward your mother, your responsibility, the love that you have for people and these places cannot really be fully realized unless you let yourself sink into them and understand that you are hearing a fraction of it if you don't stop talking and really just act. And that's why we have loved what Pete has done for so long, because so much of his work eventually comes back around to explaining what's happening, that the Colorado River never reaches the sea, and all these things that we take for granted until someone tells us otherwise. And for me, I got to meet Pope Francis. I'm not a Catholic, but it didn't matter. I was dying to meet him anyway. And when I walked into his library in the Vatican, there he is, I was speechless. And I think that moment, because I think I need to form a language to even understand why I'd been invited to meet him. And we kind of hooked in on how he feels about the distance, what's happened in human communities and what's happened to the non-human world, and the necessity to, brick by brick, listen to the absence of things. And I don't know. I'm a real proponent of silence and how loud silence is. And what you, even when we're old, like me, if you are silent and put yourself out there and you don't take your phone and you don't take all this accoutrement that you think that you need, you will find a part of yourself and a part of that landscape that you're in that heretofore you might not have recognized in the mirror. So that's what I think about silence.
I have a question for you. Obviously, we're having worked in the field of climate and water and resources. We're in a very challenging place. I think it's actually a time where we want to embrace silence in nature. We also want to be incredibly noisy if we care about these places, from conservation right down to women's rights. I could go down a long list. But do you find hope at your age in what you've seen and what you've done? Because you've done a lot.
I get asked all the time, are you hopeful, Birdie? And I've decided that hope is an absolute worthless word. in terms of like evil. If he was sitting here, he'd say, yeah, like gourmet or adventure. Because it's become, it's dulled. Our senses are dulled by it. And I've come to think that hope is an acquiescence. I hope you're out there doing something. I hope because somewhere, somebody out there sees this as seriously as I do and must be doing something. And I say, forget it. Hope, you have to earn hope. If you want hope, then you have to, it's not a right. You have to earn it. I think we should stop talking about hope unless it's an active description. What are you doing? What am I doing? What are any of us doing? So, am I hopeful in this century? I think it's really tough. I don't think anybody in here is probably disagrees with that. I'm more optimistic, as Arnie Ness was, for the next century, because people who come out of the strife that we seem to inch closer toward over the last few decades, they will have returned to this understanding, I think, that we do depend on nature. We do depend on one another to survive. I need you to be healthy and have a dignified life, because if you don't, it is that moment of scarcity that creates war, and the war on nature. It doesn't matter what it is. So I need you to work for me, and we work for each other. And I mean, whether it's a jaguar, it's a cell, a single cell in some river in Kenya you'll never see. I don't want to depend on my hope, because it is an abdication, and I am not in the mood to abdicate. That's what I think.
Remind us the quote you love from one cantankerous writer.
Oh, yeah. Are there a lot of cantankerous people out here? Raise your hand. Okay. Ed Abbey. Sentiment without action is the ruination of the soul. Yes.
So we have time for some questions.
Comments,
if you have
questions.
any, whatever you want to say. Or we can just sit in silence.
Anybody?
There's one here, yeah, Cody.
Are you willing to take a question about your book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying seeing silence, and for me, it's very poignant that the prologue was written by Eric Weinmeier, and I wonder how that came about.
So I did not plant Cody in there to do the PR thing, but I did do a book project called Seeing Silence that is here. But the guy who wrote the prologue is a remarkable individual named Eric Weinmeier, who's the first human to climb Mount Everest blind. If that doesn't impress you, he kayaked the Grand Canyon blind. He lost his sight at age 14. He's an incredible adventurer, and he's not afraid. And he relies on great teams to get him to do this, but he believes that you can do anything and overcome anything with spirit and, of course, listening carefully. And so I got to know him through film work, and I asked him, and he said, absolutely. And then he did a great job, and he wrote this amazing piece about what he could see through his ears when he reached the summit of Mount Everest, which is very profound. And I went to his house, which is amazing. He lives alone now. He has a family, but he sadly got divorced. But he has a climbing gym downstairs in the basement. He can find his way down there. He climbs, he comes back up, he makes me a cup of tea, and then he says, you want me to sign the book? I'm like, yeah, sure. And he just sort of figured things out, and then he worked around and he signed his name perfectly in the book. And he hasn't seen a single thing in the last 40 years. So anyway, he's an individual that creates hope for me. Yeah, there's one behind you, Dick. Go ahead.
First off, I want to say thank you for this talk. It's been amazing. My family is very, very dedicated to nature, and I just really relate to a lot of what you've said. And with that, like the work that both of you have put in, I'm sure there have been trials and stuff. Like we've just heard about all the beauty and like the outcomes of it, but through all those trials, have there been really like a specific experience for either of you where you really just felt like it was all worth it and like something that was really like gratifying in your professional life?
So the question, if I have this correctly, is there any moments where I feel like we've, some hope, some gratification out of it? And I think actually seeing what we could do and return the Colorado River to the sea in my lifetime, even we drained it basically in my lifetime, and then the fact we could return it was very powerful. They were going to do it again, and they haven't because it's gotten hotter and drier with climate change and more people moving to the west. But I recently found a sliver of hope that I didn't expect as I went to do a story on Lake Powell, which, if you don't know Lake Powell, it's the second largest reservoir in the United States. It sits behind Glen Canyon Dam above the Grand Canyon. It's at 24% full. It's coming up a little bit right now, but it's been dropping for the last 2 decades. But when I went there, I was expecting to see what they call drought porn, sunken boats and all this sort of, the life we once had is gone. But I found another life that I had never known because it had been underwater my entire life. Glen Canyon, the place that we drowned, is back. And the white bathtub rings are washing away and wildlife is returning. I saw a freshwater orchid, I didn't even know this existed, growing in the upper slot canyons of Escalante. And I was reminded that nature bats last, and there is some hope in that if we can figure out a way to work with it. I think there was one here and then one here.
Hey, Chris, you mentioned Arne Naess, and I just curious how you know him, and I just, excuse my naivety, but just wondered. Yeah.
Arne Naess, for those of you who don't know who he was, he's a Norwegian philosopher, alpine climber, then codger, and he really was the guy who came up with what he called deep ecology. And he reduced it not in terms of power, but in terms of how do you communicate something that's so profound as the intrinsic value of all life. And so he and Doug met in the 80s somehow, and they were like two thieves in a canyon. I mean, they really got on. And so we spent time at his place in Trevergestein, up in the hills in Norway, and he's lived with us in Chile for a while in the early 90s. And then we published the complete works of his work just as a project within our family foundation. He was a really good friend and a really unique guy. No, he died probably, what do you think, Edgar? I don't know. Yeah, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Is it at all possible in reality to build a pipeline from the Northeast in the United States to the beginnings of the Colorado River or something like that?
So the question is it possible to build a pipeline from somewhere that has more water, say the Northeast or the Midwest, to the western side of the Continental Divide, or western side of the 100th meridian, which is really between arid and wet? And people have been talking about this and are still talking about it. There was one idea to pipe water to northern Colorado from the Green River called the Million Project. There's been other concepts to bring it from the Great Lakes, but they don't know how to get the energy to get the water through or over the Continental Divide. There's been concepts to drag icebergs from Antarctica up. For every idea out there, there is a tremendous amount of energy involved and cost, and that has always outweighed the practicality of it to this point. So right now, I think the only thing that's knocking on the door, if we're going to keep populating these arid parts of the United States at the level we are, is desal. But desal is still very energy consumptive, and and complicated. There's desal plants they built in the 80s. They still haven't been running consistently. But I think a lot of the water situation we're dealing with now is learning awareness and learning how to be more efficient and closing the loop on our systems. We use single loop where we use it once and let the water go downstream. We can recycle water in ways that we have the technology to do that. So I think that's a more practical, more energy efficient way to move forward. If there's one more question, we can take it. Yep, back here. So how do we get involved? I think you can talk to Chris and you tell how to get involved with your organization. But the organizations I've worked with, there's a guy wandering around out here who works with a local nonprofit called EcoFlight that gives people awareness through flying in small planes to make people kind of realize of the changes. Grand Canyon Trust is a group I work with that works with native tribal communities and brings a native voice back to the table, which I think is critical. All the natives when I was in the Grand Canyon told me to listen to the canyon, which when I first heard that, I was like, what? And now I'm like, of course. That's another group. And then there's the big national organizations, I think, working on this from American Rivers to Nature Conservancy. There are a lot of people trying, and I think we need people beating the drum behind it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I think we're happy to tell you about our work through Carolyn, who's up here in the front seat, but also especially like Grand Canyon Trust. There's so many smaller groups working on water issues, working on protecting the West, really throughout the United States. But since you're here, definitely we could all point you toward groups who are really, really skilled and effective at what they do.
Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
It's an honor.